Welcome back once again. I'm delighted to introduce a headliner panel on the hugely topical issue of 10 years to 2030. What is the global starting point for the climate countdown? We have a fabulous panel of speakers lined up for you on this topic. So please welcome Dr. Kim Cobb, Georgia Power Chair and Professor, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, Georgia Institute of Technology. Dr. Farhana Sultana, Associate Professor, Department of Geography and the Environment, Syracuse University. Dr. Nanda Piersma, Scientific Director, HVA Expertise Center for Applied Artificial Intelligence. And Tom Peacock-Nazil, Founder, 7 Clean Seas. And here to make sure that everyone has their say, please welcome your moderator, Dr. Adam Levy, Science Journalist and Climate Change Communicator. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor to be asked to moderate this panel. There's some fantastic company here to steer us all through this incredibly important, incredibly timely topic. I'm just going to wait for 1 second so that Kim and Farhana can rejoin us. While we're waiting for Kim, why don't I turn to Farhana? And Farhana, perhaps you could introduce yourself and explain your background a little bit.
Hi, thank you for having me here today. It's a delight to join you. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University in New York, USA. And my work looks at issues around climate and water governance, but largely around issues of what's happening globally, but particularly on issues around climate justice.
Great. And Kim, I think maybe just let me ask you now, Kim, whether you'd be able to introduce yourself and your work.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, having some technical issues this morning. Apologies. So my name is Kim Cobb. I'm a professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology and the director of Georgia Tech's Global Change Program. And I'm really a climate scientist by training. I work on the history of climate extremes as recorded in paleoclimate archives of the distant past, trying to understand what might be changing about today. And my research portfolio these days also has shifted to include a large focus on climate solutions, particular coastal solutions focused on climate justice issues. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kim. Let's turn now to Nanda. Nanda, would you be able to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, hello. Hello from Amsterdam, where we're supposed to be meeting for this World Summit. I'm sorry about that, but it's good that we are online. I am the Scientific Director of the Expertise Center of Applied AI of the University of Applied Science in Amsterdam. We study methodology on how to implement and use AI systems together with the experts in the field. And we have 7 labs now in different sectors, and it can either be fintech, retail, media, smart industry. And we work in co-creation, and we improve the adoption process with ethical and responsible AI. It means that our institute works centered around Sustainable Development Goals and the donut economy model of Kate Raworth. And we are active in the climate debate, but then on a technical level. So we are thinking about storytelling and fact-checking.
Fantastic. And finally, we have Tom.
Hi there. First of all, it's a huge honor to share the spotlight with some extremely well-distinguished scientists. That is not my background, if I'm being completely honest. I am the founder of an ocean cleanup organization called 7 Clean Seas. We really focus on kind of community level intervention, waste management, and most importantly, kind of funding mechanisms to enable scalable solutions for kind of plastic leakage prevention. I think when we're looking at climate change and specifically in relation to plastic and ocean plastic, the two are extremely closely linked. The plastics industry in general has a huge part to play in kind of total greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look at the ocean and the health of the ocean and its ability to sequester carbon, it is an extremely kind of important tool that we have in our armory. So although I'm not a climate scientist, I will let these lovely panelists answer all the technical questions. we are working hard to protect the environment and find scalable solutions.
Fantastic to have you all here. I think we cover such a broad range within this panel, and we don't have as much time as we'd like. So let's start right away, and let's start with Kim. We're seeing climate change make the headlines more and more frequently as we draw the links between, for example, extreme weather events and climate change. As a climate scientist, are you surprised by the extent of the changes and the impacts of the changes that we're already seeing?
So I have to say I'm not terribly surprised at the impacts that are unfolding in front of us year on year now. I mean, wildfire season is an annual occurrence on the western coast of the United States, and hurricane season is devastating here in the southeast United States every single year, breaking more and more records. We've always known that these kinds of impacts were going to be arriving at our doorsteps. It was just a matter of when. And so I would say that while I'm not intellectually surprised by these kinds of impacts that have been long predicted, I mean, I'm only human, and they take a very large emotional toll on all of us. And so to live through them is quite another matter. To have the news reels full of communities that are so deeply impacted that will be suffering generational harm because of these kinds of impacts affects me as much as it affects anybody else on this planet. So I think what we have to do, of course, is really understand how we can help these communities turn science into solutions. We should have been having these conversations, of course, 20 years ago, but it's never too late to roll up our sleeves and put science to work in service to solutions. And again, with that eye towards helping those communities that are most acutely vulnerable today.
Now, Farhana, you work. Your work spans both the social and the physical. I think it's fair to say. How have you felt seeing these changes unfolding that I suppose have been unfolding at an ever accelerating rate? Oh, I think you're muted just now, Farhana. We still can't hear you yet, I'm afraid, unless it's only my audio that's... Okay.
All right, can you hear me now? I think I was administratively muted, so I've been administratively unmuted now. All right. So for me and the communities that I work with, around the world, climate change has never been a future phenomenon, but that's already in the past and is already occurring. And largely, this is seen in the tropical and subtropical areas of the developing world, or what is euphemistically called the global south. So I'm not surprised by what's happening, and neither are many of the communities, the frontline communities, which are usually communities of color, very impoverished communities, but then also quite resilient in the sense of getting things done and trying to live through these things and then demanding action. So I don't use the term resiliency in that kind of technocratic or euphemistic way. And I think what's really been surprising or disappointing is the lack of action from advanced industrialized countries in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, curbing fossil fuels, and taking appropriate coordinated climate action so that we can try to address things that have already been happening for centuries and decades. So one of the things that I think we really need to think about is how these impacts are longstanding, occurring across scales and sites, but then also how it's now showing up in the front doors of the advanced industrialized world. And yet these issues of extreme sea surges, rainfall patterns, flooding, droughts, tropical cyclones, hurricanes have been occurring with increasing intensity, but then also uncertainty for quite some time, which has led to a range of problems in the developing world related to land loss of livelihoods, sea level intrusions or saltwater intrusion, agriculture failure, poverty, migration, refugee status. So when we think about these issues, I think what's really important to me is that we approach it internationally and intersectorally and intersectionally through a climate justice lens.
Tom, as you mentioned, you work on plastic primarily rather than climate change itself, but how much, when you listen to what Kim and Farhana are saying, do you see that reflected in the work that you're working
Yeah, it absolutely resonates. I think Farhana kind of talking about these impoverished communities often being the ones kind of who are most vulnerable from climate change and also plastic pollution. A good example of this would be the work we're doing in Indonesia with essentially kind of fishing communities, coastal communities in low-lying areas. I'm currently sat in Singapore on this webinar, and we're one of the first countries in the world to actually be kind of experiencing climate change in a measurable, in a real measurable way. We're up, I think it's over 1 degree Celsius in mean temperature since the mid 70s. And we don't have to go very far from Singapore, which obviously is a well economically developed country, to get to kind of Batam, Bintan, parts of the Riau archipelago in Indonesia, where poverty is absolutely rife. Plastic pollution is rife, and these people are completely reliant on the ocean for what it has. When this does kind of come around and it starts to not be, 1 degree warming over a small amount of time, but it gets more and more extreme, it's going to be these communities that suffer the greatest, I think. And I can't see a solution at the moment that is on the table that's going to be really supporting these communities and finding a way to protect them moving forward. It's a bit sad, really, but yeah, there doesn't seem to be anything on the table that's really taking into account these rural and island locations.
We'll come back later in the talk to this idea of where action is today and where it needs to be. But before we get to that, I'd like to turn to you, Nanda, and ask just how important the role of information technologies and data collection, data assessment are in not only understanding the impacts, but also understanding the actions to mitigate these environmental issues.
Yes, thank you. Well, we worked on mathematical modeling of scenarios of what could happen in the climate debate, but also in the climate change. And yeah, we calculated long before this exponential development that we're seeing now. And I really agree with Farhana with saying it was first shown in the less developed countries, but now also in the industrial countries. You can calculate all that. But the tricky thing is, what can you do and who is doing what? And now we see with the data collection that we have, it is an energy consuming activity. And I think it's also a call to action for our IT community to start rethinking of all the IT developments that we are now pursuing. We have lots of computer power, we have lots of data hoarding. Do we really need all this? And do we have the right data to work with at this point? So my point is, before the debate on the climate change was dominated by experts, and there were always facts as arguments. And now we see that sentiment is the new argument in the climate debate, where everybody wants to have their say about what they think is true. And we even have the filter bubbles that people are working in, and they are not debating on facts anymore. They're debating on sentiment, and that doesn't help the debate. I think what we need now is to have the IT community and the data community to help with real storytelling based on facts in the sentiment, and combine these two forces that we see now. And no one can say that we didn't pass the tipping point where we really have to do something. And that tipping point is now gone, and now we have to all work together to change this.
Now, I suppose we've been discussing the state of these issues today, but we haven't yet really come to the action that does exist to try and fight them. Now, Thomas, you touched on this a little bit. How would you say is the state of action in tackling issues around waste?
This is a really important topic, because I think there's some parallels here with fixing any crisis. What we're finding in rural and island locations, based on System IQ's recent paper, Breaking the Wave, they've estimated that 45% of all ocean plastic, for example, is originating in these rural and island locations. Now, the reason that's happening is because they've got a unique geography and makeup, essentially. You've got low population density, you've got low plastic density. Essentially, to aggregate waste and plastic in those kind of areas, it's very time consuming, expensive, and laborious. So when you finally get to try and sell that plastic on the other end in your traditional economic model, it just doesn't make financial sense. And if it doesn't make financial sense, you cannot expect people to go build waste management infrastructure in these locations, because who's going to pay for it? And I think although that is something I would love to see governments pick up the bill for, I don't think it's realistic to expect that to happen. And I think what we're seeing in waste management is this is a prolific issue that we are trying to fix. Find alternative funding mechanisms that maybe are not connected to material value, to be able to have a supplementary investment kind of pot of money that you can put into these locations. I think with climate change and climate change solutions, it's exactly the same. There's a lot of good work out there. There's amazing amount of science and solutions for decarbonisation, but until you can make that economically feasible, and it doesn't have to be technically feasible, that's almost irrelevant. It has to be economically feasible before we'll be able to roll it out at scale. And I think that's what we need to remember as we implement these systems or come up with new technologies. How can we use traditional economics and almost the capitalist system to really encourage the widespread adoption of these solutions?
Now, Tom's talking there about the differential ability of different parts of the world to adapt to or to mitigate these issues. Farhana, how do you see that reflected in climate change?
There's absolutely differential vulnerability, differential capabilities, but then also we're dealing with communities and countries that have long been imbricated in histories of colonialism and imperialism and development debt and globalization and trade wars that come with it. So all of these issues that are kind of overlapping and compounding dealing or addressing only climate are issues that are increasingly becoming important, and I think people are recognizing that. And I think this is why the issue of climate justice has gained so much traction in recent years, because for many decades we were talking about global warming, sea level rise, then climate change, and recently people have started talking about climate justice in the mainstream. We're not talking about activists who are fighting for this for some time, but it's largely because climate change addresses those systems of inequality, because it's about systemic change, it's about systems change, and it looks at addressing those structural inequities and power systems that uphold those inequities. So because there are uneven burdens and harms, that kind of compound vulnerabilities or increase exposures, and as a result, the climate justice lens that is increasingly in the international negotiations, in bilateral and multilateral discussions, they look at issues about, first recognition, but then also responsibility to harm, about these issues around vulnerability, but then also about morality and ethics. Like, how can we think about responsibility and action, accountability, reparations, or reducing harm, beyond just talking about it, but it means first identifying these variegated injustices that exist and then trying to address the underlying causes. So this means that increasingly there's greater education about this, awareness building, but then also how it's being enrolled in planning and decision-making and policies and international cooperation. So I think to address these great unevenness and distribution and harm and responsibility, but then also in terms of impact, we need to have greater discussions that are informed by a justice lens.
Now, Kim, perhaps you'd be able to give us, I suppose, a really big picture understanding of where we are today. Where is global action on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions today, and where ought it be?
Well, as I said earlier, this kind of conversation that we're having today is the kind of conversation I would have hope that we would have had in circa 2000 when we had the awareness, we had a firm understanding of the science, what was coming down the pike. And these kinds of fits and starts is really, 20 years, overdue. And that's where we are. We find ourselves in these fits and starts, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And we're out of time right now, quite clearly. And, to me, the number one thing that I try to communicate to a very distressed public over these kinds of issues is that there's still so much to save. So there's that book on my dresser there, All We Can Save, that just was released, that really helps us frame this conversation from a feminist lens about all that is still possible in the fight against climate change, and how worthy this cause is and how close it is in our grasp. And so actually, I think we have seen a sea change over the last, 3 to 5 years, I would say, in the urgency around action, as these impacts have just been so unrelenting. So I do feel, while I feel it's overdue, I feel like kind of the stars are aligning for something of the right scale and the right magnitude to the problem. And to echo what Farhana said about the importance of climate justice, when you look at very successful policies, it's not really about just harnessing profit margins and market capital. It's really about making sure that you have a comprehensive solution that recognizes some of the systemic injustices, the fact that we can't leave people behind in this transition. We absolutely will fail, capital F, if we don't think about doing this transition in a just way. And so I'm late to this talking point, admittedly, as a climate scientist with a physical background, but my work on the coast has really helped illustrate this point quite clearly, which is that the frontline communities, they have inherent resilience, they have inherent wisdom and the lived experience that we can all learn from. And so we can build these frameworks for thinking about comprehensive climate solutions, working extremely closely with these communities in deep partnership. And so that's really, what has to happen on these smaller scales, like with my project, but also at the larger scale when we think about incoming President Biden's climate policies in this space, very focused on environmental justice issues, very focused on making deep investments in low carbon technologies and economic capital in areas that have been historically harmed by the fossil fuel infrastructure. So when you think about the kind of win-win spaces we can build when we do so mindfully, and we think about these partnerships across sectors, and we think about how to harness the capitalist frameworks for broader good, then we're really moving in the right direction. And that's the lesson that we can learn while we're late to the game. That is one of the things that we know will be a resounding, I think, hallmark of successful climate policy in the 21st century.
Farhana, Kim mentioned just there that she feels that there has been a real change in the tone of the conversation over the last few years. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yes, in the last few years, definitely, because there's been greater international pressure from activist communities, from students in the industrialized world, but then also greater attention being paid to what the developing world has been saying since the 1980s, since the beginning of IPCC and all of the negotiations and all the COPs. And those kinds of comprehensive approaches are much more, what can I say, more equitable, or at least representational dialogues. And I think what we're seeing is that it's not as rigorous as maybe perhaps some of us would like it to be, but I think those international coordinations and cooperations have improved. Not that the Paris Agreement is some utopian solution, but it was something better than nothing, and the US withdrawing from it has not been a very good thing, and hopefully we'll be rejoining fairly soon in January. But I think the important thing is that there's greater recognition, and therefore there's greater responsibility. And people are addressing these issues critically and not just thinking about moving targets and not just deploying rhetorical gestures, but actually thinking through what does it mean, both for internal domestic issues, but then also in terms of relationality to other countries and other communities. And I think one of the things that has become more evident is that how much the dialogues have started to include more voices, and that could be because of different kinds of platforms being available, whether it's social media, but then also through coordinated efforts, also greater education and awareness. But one of the things that increasingly a lot of the young folk are thinking about is not just intergenerational in the future, but then intra and then also spatial responsibility. So what is happening now and what has happened before. And that means thinking about internalizing the externalities of production and consumption. So how do we take into account things about hyperconsumption, about fossil fuel dependency, about these endless capitalist growth models on a finite planet? And then how can we think about what does sustainability mean, or what does critiquing sustainable development mean? What are the different models of well-being for communities and the planet overall that is not about endless growth and exploitation and extractive model of development, but thinking about what are the ways we can be more responsible, what are the ways we can reduce harm? And I think international dialogue on this has been shifting, and I'm hopeful that we can have more transformational and more rigorous and more impactful change in the coming years, because it's well past time to do things, and we need to ramp up what we do.
Tom, I think perhaps everyone here is aware that the conversation about plastic has gone from maybe almost non-existent to a relatively loud conversation. But to what extent is that conversation taking these issues of, for example, equity into account?
Yeah, so I think you could look at it and almost say this has happened in the last 3 years. Since kind of mid-2017, there's just been an explosion in kind of interest and popularity around the issue of ocean plastic pollution. What we've found, and I'm not sure whether this is backed up by any kind of empirical data, but very much we get the impression that plastic pollution with its tangibility is a great kind of starting place for so many people who weren't necessarily kind of so involved with kind of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, but still kind of on the scale, they become very passionate about plastic pollution because it is such a tangible thing in their lives. They can see it, they can see the direct harm that it causes, unlike climate change, which is a little bit more difficult to make that connection. In kind of that journey, I think it's, and what we've seen, and we've spoken to so many people about this, I'd love someone to do a research paper on this, but there seems to definitely be kind of a shift then. Okay, now we're involved with this sustainability kind of theory of ocean plastic pollution. What else is out there? And it seems to be kind of the next thing is looking at, okay, climate change, deforestation, wildlife conservation, kind of biodiversity loss, all sorts of different things. It's almost like a gateway drug, I think, because it's the one that's really tangible and really in our face. And I love it for that, because not only does it need the attention itself as an issue of our time, but if it can then lead people down that road of sustainability that leads to essentially the biggest existential crisis around climate change, then it's serving a multiple purposes.
Nanda, what has the role of, I suppose, digital technologies been in this shift in discourse that we've seen, and what should its role be in the future?
Yes, I'm heading an expertise center in applied AI, and especially typically what Tom is telling is storytelling, not only on getting people alerted about the problem, but also think about solutions and think about actions, what you can do. So we are using methodology, IT methodology, in more than one way, not only just calculating what can happen, but also to imagine a new world, to see what we can do, to include stakeholders and to see who is, there are complex models that you can use to see how different stakeholders and shareholders, how they interact, and what is the effect if there's one person changing his behavior, what the effect is on all the other shareholders. You can all calculate that using the IT and using mathematical modeling. we can work on implementation and realization and use tech to get the solutions going. And I have an example in Amsterdam. We have a large charge infrastructure for electric vehicles and try to reduce the amount of fossil cars. And then we said, okay, we also want to do this for trucks and large vehicles, but they need the amount of energy, about the size of the city of Dublin, just to move around the Netherlands, and it doesn't work. So now we are working on new models. How do you scale certain solutions, and what would it take, and calculate solution space, and what would be a feasible solution and what would not be a feasible solution. So we have now all the low-hanging fruits and all the inclusive directions that we can do. You can do this, you can do this. It should be all together, and we can calculate which one are the most effective means. But meanwhile, we need storytelling, like the story that Tom is telling us.
Let's look now to the future, and I suppose the future is now looking slightly different from how it looked a year ago. Kim, how do you personally feel the potential for action on climate change has been shifted as a result of the pandemic?
Yes, I mean, I think it's actually, I think, really been wonderful to have these discussions around the importance of centering science as a tool for public health. You know, I mean, this is really one of the core messages of the pandemic. When you ignore science, it's going to come back to bite you. And that's true for the pandemic, and that's absolutely the case for climate change. We absolutely need evidence-based leadership at all levels. So we've seen here in the United States how we need the mayors at the city level, the governors to be engaged, and we need an effective federal plan for the pandemic. And climate change is no different. So I think there are some core lessons that we can take from the pandemic and carry them over and to help us shape effective policy to protect public health, because that's absolutely what good climate policy is about. It's about lives and livelihoods here. And so I think we need to continue to make that message. We can sharpen it now that people understand how something that looks like a short-term compromise can lead to very long-term damages. And that's another important talking point. I think something else that I think has been drilled into all of our heads with, you know, unfortunately for me, I have 4 children homeschooling right now, just how quickly we can adapt to very radical changes. And, you know, we were talking, you know, last year about, you know, some very small modifications in the way that my university does business and in the way that we fly to conferences or not, you know, and people were saying the Americans will never go for that. You know, we have all lived through a chapter where, you know, we have lived through hell and back. And unfortunately, the casualties of that shock are still with us. They'll be with us for an extremely long time with these vast inequities that have been exacerbated. But when we look back on this, I think we will see that, wow, you know, we really are talking about very marginal changes here that have economic gain attached to them when you talk about climate change. And that whole pandemic mess back there is such an extreme point that we will have lived through with these economic damages that we'll forever be shifting the conversation about what's possible with climate change. That's kind of my hope. And of course, there's the COVID recovery packages that governments are contemplating, and to the tune of trillions of dollars here in the United States. And how can we deploy those in service to climate solutions, including climate justice issues? How can we accelerate progress? And I think this is the big question that is going on right now, not only in the United States, but internationally as well, obviously hoping that we can really accelerate progress on climate change while we accelerate recovery from the pandemic.
The coronavirus pandemic has, of course, taught us that the world can take big, decisive action when it needs to. But a lot of that action has left the most vulnerable people behind to some extent. Farhana, what do you think are the key lessons in this regard from the last year that we can take and maybe try and do a better job when it comes to climate change?
So I think what we can think about this last year, and then also going into the future, because next year will likely be similar until we get a handle on the pandemic. What we're seeing in frontline communities, both in the advanced industrialized world, whether it's communities of color, indigenous communities, but then also, impoverished and marginalized communities in the developing world, is that there are two overlapping crises that are simultaneously occurring, right? The climate crisis that is accelerating, and then the coronavirus pandemic crisis that arrived, thereby compounding the vulnerabilities. And I think what happened is we did see that immediate shift in priorities, with public health concerns and lockdowns and protocols being in place. But I think one thing that's increasingly being recognized, or should be recognized, is that both the coronavirus pandemic and climate change emerged out of a certain specific set of very destructive capitalist extraction ideologies that destroys natural habitats, that are, increase human wildlife, exposures. And in many ways, both climate change and the pandemic are man-made crises. So therefore, if we can trace these connections, we can start to think about how the current pandemic is likely to be more frequent as climate breakdowns into the future. So therefore, we're going to likely see greater vulnerability, greater suffering, greater loss of life and livelihood, but then also entire destruction of homelands and communities. So if we think about this pandemic not being an anomaly, but being a symptom of an underlying very problematic way we have been treating peoples in sacrifice zones, the planet, for several centuries, we can start to think about how the coronavirus pandemic has actually raised awareness about these nature, society, or human environment connections. But then what does it mean to build back better? What does it mean to think about climate justice as being part of those equitable and international relationships when we think about post-pandemic recovery? And I think one of the important things is that we really need to think about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary sciences, which includes the social sciences, as well as involvement with average citizens beyond experts, because the lived experiences and wisdoms of frontline communities are extremely important. Their experiences of dealing with the climate crisis and the overlapping coronavirus pandemic crisis can shed not just, stories from us to learn from, but to recognize that this is going to become a lot of people's future. But at the same time, I think what really worries me is that we've seen the international community in the last 2 years talk about climate apartheid, how you're going to have the haves and have-nots and this separation of, what happens with climate crisis. My concern is with an overlying layer of the pandemic crisis, we're going to see that kind of pandemic apartheid that sits alongside climate apartheid. And those are overlapping communities of very wealthy, folks who can get away, who can have access to the vaccines or healthcare or, finances and places to go. But when we think about these issues, I think we need to think about underlying destructive ideologies and start to shift those.
Now, Nanda, unfortunately, we're running short on time, but I would love to briefly know your thoughts looking at the events of 2020 and how misinformation has spread even for something we experienced so directly as a pandemic, and the role of data and information technologies in curbing that spread, either for coronavirus or for climate change.
Well, this is sort of our world. We are constantly simulating new situations or pandemic situations in every sort of field. And it's really sad that now it's a reality and we are facing the consequences of what for us is sort of a computer game that we can play. And I think that for us it's now an adjustment in the tech community to have new data sets or different data sets. Everything is different. There's different pollution and there's different mobility figures. Everything is different. So that's a challenge. Everybody's really happy. We have new data sets that we can work on. But on the other side, we have a call to action for the IT community to help solve this climate crisis and to help solve this pandemic crisis. I really agree with Kim that there's a new understanding of what experts and the academics can do. And I think that's the time to really progress now and work together with everyone to help this climate crisis into the right way.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, although I wish we could continue this conversation even further. I would like to thank you all for the fascinating insights. Dr. Kim Cobb, Dr. Farhana Sultana, Dr. Nanda Piersma, and Tom Peacock-Nazil. So thank you to all my panelists, and I will now hand back to the organizing team.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. I think we all wish that could have gone on for longer. There was some fascinating insights there. We're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be back with you shortly in about 5 minutes' time.